She stood there in her wedding dress, drenched from the rain, abandoned in altar, mascara streaking down her face as she watched her dreams wash away with the storm. When the auto shop's door creaked open, she expected judgment but found only quiet understanding in the eyes of a man who knew what it meant to lose everything. Today's story explores an unexpected shelter found in a humble garage. A mechanic, still mourning his wife after 6 years, opens his door to a bride left at the altar. Their paths cross at their lowest moments, showing how healing often begins where we least expect it, between two strangers connected by loss and the courage to move forward. Every subscriber means the world to me, and your support keeps these incredible stories coming. If you love heartwarming journeys and unexpected twists, hit that subscribe button and like the video. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below and let's see how far this story has traveled. Richard's life is about to change forever. The garage stood at the edge of town, its weathered sign readers auto repair, barely visible through the Georgia downpour that had lasted 3 days straight. Rain pelted the metal roof, creating a symphony of pings and patter that most would find deafening. For Richard Reeder, it was merely background noise, as familiar as the smell of motor oil and the weight of a wrench in his hand. The cinderblock building hadn't changed much in the 15 years he'd owned it. The concrete floor remained stained with the history of countless oil changes, the walls lined with tools that hung in the exact same spots they had when Ellie was alive. 6 years had passed since cancer took her, but in this space time seemed to stand still. Richard moved among the tools with practiced precision, finding comfort in the familiar routine that had sustained him through loneliness. His calloused hands knew every tool by feel, could diagnose most engine problems by sound alone. The radio played "Wish You Were Here" by Pink Floyd, and Richard found himself quietly humming, how I wish you were here," loud enough to fill empty spaces between thoughts, quiet enough that he could pretend he wasn't listening for footsteps that would never come again. The lyric perfectly captures Richard's emotional state, mourning his wife Ellie, feeling her absence, yet finding a way to continue living. The song's melancholic tone about loss and memory matches the scene's emotional landscape. The garage held memories like ghosts. The office where they'd shared lunch, her laughing at his grease-stained sandwich wrappers. The workbench where she'd sit while he worked, legs swinging, telling him about her library customers. In the corner, her succulents still grew despite his negligent care, chosen because she had known he'd forget to water anything demanding.
Talk to them sometimes,
she had instructed during those final weeks, when they both knew but wouldn't say that she was leaving.
Plants like conversation.
He never spoke to them with words, but he touched their leaves when checking for signs of life, relieved to find them persisting. The broken vehicles flowing through his doors gave Richard purpose, fixing what others couldn't, while his own heart remained in disrepair. Mechanical problems offered comforting simplicity. Diagnose, repair, test, return. People brought their troubles disguised as sputtering engines, and he sent them away with solutions. Human grief proved more resistant to his toolbox. Locals respected his quiet nature, bringing their cars without expecting conversation beyond what repairs required. They'd learned to accept his grunts and nods as the fullest communication he could manage. Some older customers remembered how he used to be, quick with jokes, generous with smiles. But they never mentioned the change, just as they never mentioned Ellie's photo that stayed face down on his desk, too painful to view but impossible to discard. The garage had become his fortress against change, against moving forward, against the possibility of more loss. Within these walls, Richard pretended time had stopped when she died. He opened at 8 each morning, closed at 6 each evening, worked through weekends and fell asleep too exhausted to dream. Have you ever felt stuck in grief like Richard? Share your story in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if this resonates with you. When the storm intensified that evening, Richard barely noticed, lost in a carburetor rebuild as rain hammered the roof. The Mustang's engine parts spread before him told a story of neglect, not unlike his own heart. He understood machines. Their problems had clear solutions. Replace this, adjust that, and harmony returns. The succulents in the corner represented the last living connection to Ellie's touch. Keeping them alive kept a piece of her with him. She had always believed in nurturing things in second chances.
Everything deserves care,
she'd say, whether discussing a struggling plant, a rusty car, or a person worn down by life. Thunder cracked overhead and Richard checked his watch. 8:30 p.m. past closing time. The thought of his empty apartment above, with its untouched side of the bed and her books still stacked on the nightstand, made the decision easy. He'd stay, work until exhaustion claimed him, then sleep on the office couch as he often did when the ghosts upstairs grew too loud. The sound that pierced through the downpour wasn't much, a hesitant tapping against metal, barely audible beneath the storm's persistent roar. But something about it caught Richard's attention, pulling him from the trance of his work. He paused, socket wrench suspended midair, and listened. There it was again, more insistent this time. A visitor at this hour in this weather? Richard set down his tools and moved directly to the side entrance, leaving the safety of routine behind. When he pulled the door open against the wind's resistance, the sight before him seemed plucked from some strange dream rather than the ordinary world of Georgia backroads and broken carburetors. A woman stood trembling on his doorstep in a sodden wedding gown. The once pristine white fabric clung to her frame, heavy with rain and mud. Mascara tracked down her cheeks in dark rivers, mingling with tears and raindrops. Her elaborate hairstyle had collapsed into wet tendrils framing her face.
"I'm sorry,"
she managed, her voice barely carrying over the storm.
"My car, it just stopped. Down the road, I saw your light."
Richard wordlessly stepped aside, creating space for her to enter. No questions formed on his lips. None that mattered anyway. The essential story was written across her face, in the desperate look of someone whose carefully constructed future had just shattered. He recognized that expression all too well, even if the circumstances differed. The woman, Susan, though he wouldn't learn her name until morning, stepped hesitantly into the fluorescent-lit garage. "Have you ever felt so lost that a stranger's silent understanding saved you? Tell me in the comments below." She faltered at the threshold, overwhelmed by the stark contrast between her ruined finery and this utilitarian space. The concrete floor stained with decades of motor oil seemed to announce how utterly out of place she was. A bride in a mechanic's sanctuary. Richard moved with the efficient silence of someone accustomed to his own company. He pulled out his office chair, the only one without a torn vinyl seat, and offered it to her with a slight gesture. Then he found the cleanest shop rag available, fresh from the supply delivery that morning, and placed it beside her without comment before disappearing toward the small kitchenette tucked behind the parts storage area. Alone, Susan's shoulders slumped as the weight of her actions settled upon her. The trembling intensified from both cold and psychological shock. Just hours ago she'd been standing in a church vestibule, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back had been a stranger, someone molded to fit perfectly into Thomas's family portrait. In that moment of clarity she'd walked away, eventually finding herself stranded when her borrowed car died in the storm. The garage's warmth slowly penetrated her wet clothes. Susan's gaze drifted around the organized chaos of a life devoted to fixing broken things. Tools hung in precise arrangements on pegboards. Parts awaited resurrection on metal shelves. Everything had its place, a stark contrast to how utterly displaced she felt. Her eyes landed on something behind the counter. A framed photograph, positioned at an angle that suggested it wasn't meant for display but couldn't be put away entirely. She made out two figures, the mechanic looking years younger and happier, standing beside a woman with gentle eyes and a wide-brimmed garden hat, surrounded by flowering plants. Susan quickly averted her gaze, feeling like an intruder on private grief. Richard returned with 2 steaming coffee mugs, the rich aroma cutting through the garage smells. He'd added his emergency sugar to both cups, recognizing shock when he saw it. He offered one to Susan, then leaned against his workbench, creating respectful distance. Their eyes met briefly, his filled with quiet understanding that required no explanation, hers with gratitude for the lack of questions. In that silent exchange, something tentative formed between two strangers who understood what it meant to have life's path suddenly disappear beneath your feet. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, type 2 in the comments. Subscribe if you believe strangers can heal each other. Share this video with someone who needs hope and like this video to support stories of real human connection. Night gave way to morning, and with it came a curious realization. In Richard's weathered garage, with its precisely arranged tools and salvaged parts, nothing was ever truly beyond repair. For Susan, still wrapped in the remains of yesterday's dreams, This world of fixable things felt like stumbling into a foreign country where she somehow understood the language. Morning light filtered through dusty windows as Susan slept on the worn office couch, Richard's spare jacket covering her shoulders. He had spent the night in his truck and now moved quietly around the shop. His eyes occasionally drifted toward the office door, wondering what would happen when she woke. When Susan finally emerged, wedding dress crumpled and hair disheveled, a quiet determination shone in her eyes. Instead of mentioning leaving, she simply asked to use his phone.
Need to cancel my flight to Belize.
She explained steadily.
No point in a honeymoon without a wedding.
Richard nodded and pointed to the wall phone, then returned to the Chevy engine. He offered no questions, no platitudes. The silence itself was a gift. The day unfolded in an unexpected rhythm, two people sharing space without demands. Richard focused on the blown head gasket while Susan sat nearby, watching his hands move through engine components with practiced precision. She observed his methodical approach to healing mechanical wounds.
That part connects to the electrical system?
She asked, pointing to the alternator. Richard looked up.
Yeah. Converts mechanical energy to electrical. Keeps the battery charged.
So everything's connected. One broken part affects everything else.
Exactly. The alternator completes a circuit.
He added, warming to her interest.
Without it, energy can't flow properly. The whole system gradually loses power.
Susan nodded thoughtfully.
Like when trust breaks, the emotional circuit shorts out and everything that once ran smoothly starts to fail.
What would you do if a stranger's unexpected kindness changed your life? Let me know in the comments below. Hit that subscribe and like button if this story resonates with you, and share with someone who needs a reminder that hope can arrive in the most unexpected places. Her observation hung between them, creating a bridge of understanding. By afternoon, Susan had discovered a broom and began sweeping dust from corners Richard had stopped noticing. She'd exchanged her wedding dress for his faded coveralls, sleeves rolled up multiple times. Yet she wore them with more comfort than she'd felt in her pristine gown. As she worked, Richard found himself explaining the garage, tool names, part functions, spark plug changes. His voice, rusty from disuse, warmed with each question she asked. There was something healing in sharing knowledge without judgment, in having someone listen with genuine interest.
Alternator replacement requires checking the entire system.
He explained, showing her wiring connections.
You have to make sure the problem hasn't spread to other components.
That makes sense.
Susan replied.
Problems rarely exist in isolation.
When a customer arrived, he seemed surprised to see a woman organizing Richard's workbench, but Richard continued their transaction as if nothing were unusual. After the customer left, Susan handed Richard a wrench he needed without being asked, the right size for the bolt he was approaching. The moment of synchronicity stopped him. Working on engines had always made sense. Diagnose, replace, restore. People were messier, less predictable. Yet standing with Susan in compatible silence, he realized that broken hearts and broken engines weren't so different. Both required patience, care, and the right tools to heal. As evening approached, Richard wiped his hands on a rag.
I can drive you wherever you need to go.
He offered awkwardly. Susan looked around at the half-cleaned garage, her eyes taking in the swept floors and arranged tools before settling on Richard.
Could I stay just one more day?
She asked quietly.
I'm not finished here yet.
Neither spoke the obvious truth, that she might not have been referring to the cleaning at all. The unspoken question lingered in the garage like the faint scent of motor oil and new possibilities. In this space where broken things came to be mended, two broken people were discovering that transformation rarely follows a repair manual. As Susan's request to stay hung in the air between them, neither could have predicted how a simple auto shop would become the canvas for their healing. Days melted into one another as Susan's presence gradually breathed life into the once stagnant space. The metal calendar on the wall, frozen for years on May 2019, now displayed the current month with appointments in Susan's flowing script. It had become a tool to navigate the present rather than an anchor to the past.
I think customers would appreciate a place to wait that doesn't smell like transmission fluid.
Susan suggested, gesturing toward the empty corner. Richard nodded in agreement. The next day she arranged two mismatched chairs salvaged from the thrift store, positioning them where morning light streamed through the windows.
Like these chairs.
Susan mused.
Some things work better in a new arrangement than they ever did alone.
The physical changes to the garage mirrored the subtle shifts occurring within Richard. His sentences grew longer, conversations extending beyond car troubles. First came discussions about engines, then stories about the town's history, and eventually, in quiet evenings, memories of Ellie. He described how they'd met when her Buick broke down, how she'd watched him work because she didn't trust mechanics, and how he'd fallen in love with her stubborn independence.
She loved those succulents.
He said, nodding toward the collection that had multiplied under Susan's care.
Said they were like people. Some need constant attention. Others thrive when you leave them alone.
Susan, arranging wildflowers in a repurposed oil can, absorbed these offerings with quiet reverence. She shared pieces of her own story, how Thomas had initially been attracted to her spontaneity, only to gradually reshape her to fit his family's expectations.
It was like being slowly erased.
She explained while organizing neglected invoices.
First my clothes were too bright, then my laugh was too loud. By the time I stood in that church vestibule, I couldn't recognize myself anymore.
A proper coffee station replaced the ancient machine that had produced liquid resembling motor oil. A box labeled Good Thoughts appeared, filled with customer thank you notes. Susan added a small chalkboard with weekly inspirational quotes.
Broken crayon still color.
Have you ever transformed a space that transformed you? Let me know in the comments below. Unexpected healing inspires you, and check out my other videos on top right corner.
You've made changes around here.
Remarked Mrs. Hendricks, settling into the waiting area.
Feels like someone actually lives here now.
Richard caught Susan's eye, noticing the slight flush that rose to her cheeks. When Susan suggested painting the walls, Richard hesitated. They had remained unchanged since Ellie had selected the color 15 years earlier. Yet after consideration, he handed her his credit card and truck keys.
Nothing too bright, please.
He cautioned, his mouth lifting in what might have been a smile. They spent the weekend painting. The radio played softly Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. During a break, Susan dipped her finger in spilled paint.
You know why I wanted to help with this place?
She asked, drawing a small heart on a paint can.
It's like resetting a broken clock. The mechanism still works, but something's preventing it from moving forward. Sometimes all it needs is someone to wind it again.
Richard nodded, understanding more than she had explicitly said. By Monday, the warm cream walls had transformed the garage. Customers brought small housewarming gifts, a plant, homemade cookies, a framed photograph from the town's centennial. Richard found himself engaged in conversations about weekend plans and sharing jokes he'd heard that morning. The garage had become a place where time moved forward again, and with it, the people within its walls. The painted walls had breathed new life into the garage, but it was the sound of Susan's ringtone that suddenly made everything feel temporary. As Richard glanced up from beneath the Toyota, he caught the slight falter in her smile when she looked at the caller ID. She stepped outside, her voice a soft murmur beneath the rain that had returned after 3 days of merciful sunshine. Something in her posture, shoulders drawn tight, one arm wrapped protectively around her middle, told him everything he needed to know before she said a word. Susan's mother had questions that couldn't be avoided any longer. Where would she live now that her apartment lease was ending? What about the boxes of her possessions, unceremoniously delivered to her parents' doorstep by Thomas's sister? The life she'd fled 3 weeks ago was demanding resolution. Richard worked in silence when she returned, cranking bolts with unnecessary strength under the Toyota. Mr. Patterson, waiting for his oil change, raised his eyebrows at the mechanic's unusual frustration.
Everything all right under there, Reader?
Mr. Patterson asked.
Fine.
Came the clipped reply. Susan moved through the day with practiced efficiency, but her gaze frequently drifted toward the road as if calculating distances. By closing time, the silence between them had grown into something solid and uncomfortable. The small folding table Susan had salvaged from the hardware store now sat in the corner of the office, holding 2 plates of spaghetti she'd prepared upstairs. Richard twisted his fork through the pasta, searching for words. 20 years of casual conversation with customers had never prepared him for this moment, when what needed saying mattered more than anything he'd ever fixed.
My mother says I should come home.
Susan finally said, her voice quiet but steady.
Figure things out from there.
Richard nodded, staring at his plate.
Makes sense.
Does it?
She studied him with the same careful attention she'd given to carburetors over the past weeks. The garage suddenly felt both too small and too vast. Every corner held evidence of their shared existence. Freshly painted walls, the orderly arrangement of mugs, tools organized by frequency of use rather than size. Cars came to him broken and he restored them. People were different. Harder to fix, harder to trust with your own broken parts.
I saw a sign at Miller's Diner.
Susan continued.
They need waitresses, and there's a room for rent above the bookstore.
Richard's head snapped up.
You're thinking of staying here.
The hope in his voice made her smile.
This town wasn't where I planned to end up, but...
Yes?
Richard interrupted, then cleared his throat.
The diner makes good pie. You'd like working there.
He gestured around them.
And the bookstore's just down the street.
Uncertainty flickered across his face as his eyes moved toward the ceiling, toward the small apartment where he'd lived alone for 6 years. Susan understood the unspoken question. She reached across the table, her fingers resting lightly on his calloused hand.
Or,
she said softly,
I could stay here, if that's something you'd want.
Her touch bridged what his words couldn't express. In the silence that followed, something profound passed between them. An understanding that temporary shelter had become the foundation for something neither had been looking for. 3 days later, Richard borrowed Jackson's truck and drove to Susan's parents' house. They loaded boxes labeled in her neat handwriting. Books, kitchen, memories. Would you risk everything for a second chance at love? Let me know in the comments below. In her childhood bedroom, Susan held up her framed accounting degree.
I never wanted to be an accountant. It was Thomas's idea. Stability, he said.
What did you want?
Richard asked.
To create something. To build.
She laughed softly.
Ironic that I found that in an auto shop.
When he reached for another box, Susan turned him toward her. The kiss happened naturally. Just two people who had found in each other's broken places a perfect fit. 6 months later, the faded sign outside the garage was replaced. Reader and Susan's Auto Repair announced their partnership to the world, though the town had recognized it long before they made it official. Seasons change in the garage now, marked not by calendars but by the flowering cycles of the garden that flourishes where once only memories grew. Susan's hands, once unfamiliar with soil, now tend to new blooms alongside Ellie's resilient succulents, separate yet harmonious. Their love story formed in the acceptance of each other's scars. They've created a sanctuary where they can both be seen and welcomed, their connection deepening because they recognize that broken pieces deserve care. The garage stands transformed, a place where damaged things find repair, where fragments reassemble into something stronger, a testament that love finds its own unexpected path forward. If you believe in standing up for what's right and creating a better world for everyone, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories. If this story inspired you to believe in the power of unexpected kindness, a super thanks helps me continue sharing tales that remind us of our shared humanity.